freedom, oh, freedom, oh, freedom over me. And before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free.
Known as the decade of prosperity, the 1950s were a time of economic growth, new technologies, and political consensus. President Eisenhower enjoyed great popularity, and the United States was a world superpower. However, under the surface, tensions were brewing, and the nation would soon be divided by the struggle for civil rights. In 1956, a group of college students from Morgan State University launched a sit-in at a segregated Jim Crow lunch counter that pioneered the civil rights movement. The Jim Crow laws were a series of laws that had enforced racial segregation since the end of the Reconstruction era in 1877. They governed every aspect of life, from public restrooms to hospitals. Now in the 1950s, as white couples flocked to segregated suburbs to live out what they believed was the true American dream, African Americans felt even more out of place in their country. This, however, was all about to change. First established in 1942 by James Farmer, CORE, or the Committee on Racial Equality, was a pioneer in the civil rights movement. With a mission to end discrimination on the basis of race in a nonviolent fashion, they had their work cut out for them. However, they were indisputably successful, forming chapters in many major cities. In 1952, Ben Everingham, Herbert Kellman, Robert Watts, and others founded the Baltimore chapter of CORE. This chapter then partnered with students from nearby Morgan State University, believing it was their responsibility to fight for their rights and enact change on their community. Morgan State University, previously known as Morgan College, was founded in 1867 as a biblical institution to train young men in the ministry. In 1917, it moved to its current location in northeast Baltimore after receiving a grant of $50,000 from Andrew Carnegie. It remained a private institution until 1939, when the state of Maryland purchased it in an effort to provide more opportunities to its black citizens, thus making it a historically black college.
We went to a 100% black school. It's a black college. 100% private. It was a Methodist school. So there was nobody who had the interest in segregation in our lives.
Morgan State students were involved in the civil rights movement from an early point, protesting in their hometown of Baltimore for the desegregation of Northwood Theater as early as 1950. Resistance to racial discrimination grew as the 50s progressed, and the African American residents of Baltimore, often overlooked for their part in the movement, were strong proponents in enforcing change. On January 20th, 1955, Morgan State students once again proved their courage and tenacity when they organized a sit-in at Reed's drugstore, taking the responsibility to fight for their rights.
So we were just a group of students who all believed that the only way you're going to have change is to change. You have to do it.
The use of sit-ins as a form of nonviolent protest dated back only a few years prior to 1942, when CORE performed the first one at a coffee shop in Chicago. This meant that the sit-in at Reed's would be a true pioneer, breaking the mold before the sit-in movement took off. Dr. Helena Hicks is one of 3 living participants from the sit-in.
It was 35 degrees, and the wind was coming down and the hill, and we were cold. And we went in, we wanted to get warm, we wanted something hot to drink. That never happened, but we at least got in and sat down, and they were so shocked. At first, they didn't know what to say to it. They didn't know what to do about it. And even though the police station was 2 blocks away, we did not fear that. And we got warm, we made our point, and we left.
Morgan State University supported their students, refusing to call the sit-in off, and forced their students to return to campus. This groundbreaking event was reported only by the Baltimore Sun the next evening. Its scarce documentation explains why so few have heard of the sit-in. On January 22nd, 2 days after Dr. Hicks and her companions took a seat at Reed's drugstore, that same paper reported complete desegregation of the chain of stores. Reed's drugstore president, Arthur Nattens, reported, "We will serve all customers throughout our entire stores, including the fountains, and this becomes effective immediately." This was a huge victory for not only the Morgan State students, but also the entire African American population in Maryland. It showed that nonviolent forms of protest were effective means of changing the world in which they lived.
I'm demanding respect. I'm demanding freedom. I'm demanding equality. I'm demanding this chance to have a different kind of life than what you think I'm entitled to. And that's what I want young people to understand. You don't settle the score with a gun. You don't settle the score with a fist fight.
This sit-in paved the way for others, such as the well-documented Greensboro sit-in, which occurred 5 years later, on February 1st, 1960, when 4 students protested to desegregate Woolworth Drugstore in North Carolina. Soon, all across the country, African Americans and whites alike were taking responsibility for their rights, all due to the tenacity and courage of the Morgan State sit-in students.